I wanted to start with a little bit of background of my path. The work that I started in graduate school was focused on argumentation and rhetorical criticism. I basically focused on how we talked about tough issues, primarily at the national level, primarily presidents. I grew weary of that work pretty quickly because most of my articles were basically focused on how badly we talked about tough issues and how we tended to talk past each other and how we tended to preach to our own choirs and kind of cherry pick evidence to kind of fit our perspective. So when I left grad school and I went to CSU 14 years ago, I shifted my work from a national perspective to a local one, and also shifted from being primarily a critic and observer to being more of a practitioner or a pracademic. So when I started the CBD about 11 years ago at CSU, the CBD is kind of an ongoing kind of experiment. And what happens when an institution with some capacity focuses on trying to elevate the quality of conversation in its local community? Basically, the CBD is an impartial resource to the Northern Colorado community. I train undergraduate students and community members in facilitation. These are some of the projects that we've worked on in the last 14 years. Almost every single one of these projects actually got initiated in the community, coming to ask us to kind of have a different kind of conversation. The CBD is really based on the theory that democracy requires pretty high quality communication, but unfortunately we don't get that naturally. Actually, naturally, we get almost the opposite. And these days in particular, my move from kind of national to local is seeing more and more wise as we deal with the dysfunction at the national level, but also as I see the importance of the local and the power of the local. And kind of the gathering kind of momentum for the argument that if we're going to save our republic, it's probably going to be at the cities and kind of rising up from there. So this is an example of one of our meetings. The young lady in the blue on the left is one of my students, has trained generally in facilitation, but also specifically on that event to help people have a conversation. So 150 people show up to talk about a tough issue, and instead of sitting in an audience listening to the expert on the stage or lining up at the microphone for 3 minutes of talking past each other, two very bad processes for tough issues, instead, we can take those 150 people and split them up into 20 groups and have small group facilitated structured discussions that can really kind of get into some of those issues and work through some of the tough tensions. So what I'm wanting to do with my talk today is kind of talk about the theory behind the CBD and make the case, hopefully, of what would happen to our democracy if every college and community across the country had a program dedicated to increasing the capacity for deliberative engagement in their local community. So I'm going to talk about three questions. First, what's the nature of the problems that we're facing in our communities? Second, what kind of talk do we need to deal with those problems? And third, how do we build capacity to support that kind of talk? When I talk about the nature of problems that we're dealing with, I talk about wicked problems, and the title kind of talks about taking this wicked problems mindset. I've been working with wicked problems about 8 years. It's kind of been exploding. A lot of people are using the terms now. It was actually developed 35 years ago by engineers who once they graduated and started working for cities, they realized that the kind of problems they were trained to solve and the kind of problems they were asked to solve were very different kind of problems. So they made this distinction between tame and wicked problems. Tame being could be a very difficult problem, but that there is an answer to it. Get smart people in the room and they'll kind of figure it out, whereas wicked problems are much more complex. Lots of different aspects to wicked problems, but the main thing I want to focus on today is this basic notion that they involve inherent competing underlying values and tensions that can't be resolved, but call for really high quality communication, require creativity, and really ask us for broad collaboration across multiple perspectives and multiple actors in society. So one quick example, water is a wicked problem in Northern Colorado, as it is in much of the West. We don't get much rain. We get a lot in May and June as the snow melts and kind of goes on by. But there's multiple increasing calls on that water from lots of different places in the community. And at the same time, we're learning more and more about the biology of the river and that we're probably taking too much water out already and it's working too hard. So it's a tough conversation that tends to polarize and people talk past each other. So we're asked to help with these. And one of the things that I do in my research, going back to my rhetorical criticism days, is I create these wicked problem slides. I look at public discourse, how people are talking about the issue, the values that they're expressing, and I try to lay them out. So these are 9 things that was clear as I looked at the talk about this that were important to people. And the reason this signifies a wicked problem, because if you look at each of these boxes one at a time, these are all good things. The problem isn't bad people with wicked values. The wickedness is in the problem, not the people. And when we take the wicked problems mindset and reframe issues in that way, we switch people from partisan adversaries to potential collaborators working this problem together. The problem, the issue, the reason it's wicked are the tensions between these boxes. That as we focus on some of these, we inherently are probably working against the other. The problem is that most of the conversation out there, whether it's the activist conversation or experts, exists within the boxes, right? Our brains like things simple. Our brains like things kind of good versus evil. So we want to frame things as if I have a good value and the people that disagree with me reject that value. In reality, most of the problems we're dealing with have these competing aligning values. The work that I do is how do we identify those values, then identify the tensions, put them on the table, and help our communities work through them more productively. So here's another example. Wicked is food. We want food to do lots of things for our society, but in particular, we want food to be our choice. We don't like being told what to eat, so that adds kind of another dimension to the wickedness. Healthcare can be a very simple, but perhaps in some ways the most complex wicked problem. Capitalism itself can be framed as a wicked problem, particularly from a triple bottom line perspective. And this one kind of gives you a good sense that the tensions aren't kind of automatic zero sum. There is a tension, but they can be transcended in some ways. So sometimes we're focused on balancing the values. Sometimes we're hoping to transcend the values. Sometimes we have to prioritize and make some tough decisions on those values. I imagine parking might be a wicked problem in some of your campuses. When I was asked to work on parking, it sounded kind of boring and kind of technical. Then I started looking at surveys, and all these values start tumbling out, right? So it's particularly wicked. I do a lot of K-12 stuff. K-12 is particularly susceptible to these kind of buzz terms that sound great and get a lot of support. But the power of buzz terms are often because they hide a pretty important tension that eventually is going to come out and make things more difficult. Lastly, I'll argue that democracy itself is a wicked problem. And I think the founders knew this, because when they framed it as to form a more perfect union, they realized that we were never going to get it quite right. They realized that the ideals that our country is based on is going to be constantly in tension with each other. I think John Dewey also got it right, that democracy has to be an ongoing conversation. And I think the quality of your conversation in many ways is going to dictate the quality of your community as we move forward. But within the preamble of the Constitution, there are 5 big American values. If we translate those into a little bit more modern terms, we get the wicked problem slide for democracy. And if we look at these 5 values one at a time, they're all good things. Right? If I asked you right now, I imagine there would be some pretty strong consensus that most people in the room prefer justice to injustice, or safety to danger. Right? So in some ways, the philosophy of wicked problems mindset is we all in a lot of ways have the same values. What makes us different is how we rank those values, and those can be some serious differences that we need to kind of think through in a lot of different ways. So what's different is how we rank. So I've asked people how to rank these. We couldn't do this today, but this is about 175 college students at the Colorado Leadership Summit in February. When I asked people to ask, what's most important to you out of these 5? If I have more than 10 people in the room, I've been doing this about 150 times the last 10 years, every single value normally gets picked at least once, right? And if I ask people for the least important value, again, every single value gets picked quite often, right? So again, we all have the same values, but we rank them differently. The reason those rankings are important is because when we're making specific decisions on issues, the tensions inherent to these values often come up, right? Here are some of the key tensions that I work in. These are basic democratic tensions that are always going to be with us. That's a constant conversation we need to be having, and how do we work to improve the quality of that conversation. Here are some other tensions that again and again come up in my work as I'm trying to help my community identify those tensions, put them on the table, and help them work through it productively. So if we're dealing with wicked problems in our communities, how do we talk to each other to deal with these problems better? So I've developed this typology that I've been playing with for the last 10 years of these kind of 3 basic ways to talk. They're not mutually exclusive. They mix in lots of different ways, right? But the adversarial model is primarily people that have already made their minds made up, and all they're trying to do is convince people that they're right. And that certainly kind of incentivizes a certain kind of communication, right? The expert model kind of tries to narrow the frame to kind of rigorous data, empirical issues and metrics and those type of things. And obviously the deliberative model focuses on interaction and collaboration and those type of things. I found that they each have their pros and cons, they each have their value. I found over the last 10 years that if we do the deliberative model well, we bring out the best in the adversarial and expert and tend to avoid the worst. The biggest problem here, though, is for the adversarial model and the expert model, the 2 dominant models that we have in our society, they do really poorly with wicked problems and are actually rather counterproductive, right? And if we have models of communication that are overly adversarial, which I think most of y'all agree at the national level, our politics are hyper-partisan right now, there's a lot of negative repercussions to the quality of conversation, therefore the quality of our decisions, and particularly the quality of our relationships. If I could sum up this slide with just one phrase, as an old argumentation scholar, I'd make the argument that right now our national political system rewards bad argument and punishes good argument. And wicked problems are tough on their own without adding that additional layer. I also mentioned on there that it plays into the flaws of human nature. That's been the focus of my work for the last 2 years, of really digging into social psychology and brain science. And one of the research conclusions I came with is most of our national political system is designed in a way that brings out the worst in human nature and rarely taps into the good. And we really need to turn that around. Similarly, we can't kind of give up on democracy. That argument of giving up on democracy and giving the responsibility to experts is kind of coming back again, right? Back in fashion. The problem is experts don't do very well with wicked problems either, right? Experts by definition know a whole bunch about a little bit, right? So they struggle with systemic issues. Experts don't like to deal with values, much less a tension between multiple values. So yes, experts are critical. They need to help us to make better decisions, but we can't defer those decisions to the experts. So that leaves us with deliberative engagement. Lots of different words for that this come with, and I'm sure people in the room phrase this and frame your work in very different ways. But I think the common ground across all this, it is kind of a focus on process. And if I was to summarize my whole talk in 2 words, it would be that process matters, right? But the deliberative perspective is some sort of deliberative practitioner or neutral convener that's designing a process for interaction for a particular purpose, and particularly to kind of spark better conversation. So I'm going to quickly kind of touch on just 5 components of deliberative engagement. This is the work that the CVD tries to provide to its community. If you're new to this kind of aspect of the work, the National Coalition of Dialogue and Deliberation is just a wonderful umbrella organization that kind of covers and a great place to kind of start to look at things. But the 5 things that I do to kind of change the conversation, one is to have that overall deliberative framing in terms of wicked problem. What happens when someone's framing things not to persuade people, but to make it okay to be uncertain, to struggle with those tensions. We often use discussion guides or backgrounders to frame the conversation, to something to react to. We work really hard. Probably the hardest part of our work is to have small, diverse representative groups so they can actually interact with each other and have conversations and learn from each other. And then process is designed not just to allow people to express their opinion, like most of our public process, but are designed for people to listen to each other and ask each other questions and to interact and to refine their opinions and to develop mutual understanding and respect, all critical aspects of community and democracy. And then last, deliberative facilitators that can bring this all together, that are putting all their energy and all their skills to improve that conversation, not just to be a better communicator in a bad environment, but to elevate the quality of the communication around them. The problem is this is a pretty rare for people that are willing to play this role, or pretty expensive, but students are a great aspect to fill this role in your community. So I'll end with, how can we best build community capacity to support these processes? And the first step is realizing you have wicked problems, of shifting your framework from trying to win the argument to understand and help frame the argument and improve the communication around you. I've developed this concept of passion and impartiality to kind of explain the ethic of my work. And it's purposely an oxymoron to kind of highlight the tension, right? But it's also to particularly highlight the difference that the work that I do is not a detached neutrality, right? But I have commitments. So while I need to be impartial, I need to build that reputation for impartiality, and I'm going to be impartial in that specific topic that we're doing, I'm partisan for democracy, right? And I'm partisan I'm passionate about my community, I'm passionate about solving problems. So I have commitments to equality and inclusion, to serve small d democracy, but I also have commitments to sound data and reasoning. And that bottom tension is the ongoing tension between democracy and expertise that we'll always deal with. We can't avoid that tension. We can't just pick one side of the tension. We have to identify that tension, put it on the table, and help our communities work through that. And what better institution can do this than our country's colleges and universities to do this work? So I'll close with something I've written. I've spent the last 6 years working with the Kettering Foundation Center for Public Life, helping people start these centers that focus on deliberative engagement in their community. I've framed it as a win-win-win-win, that students get great experience and a skill set that's critical to 21st century, that faculty get a chance to really negotiate the tension between theory and practice and make a real impact. Universities and colleges can play the role, that their mentor role in their community, of elevating the level of conversation, not just kind of adding knowledge into a bad kind of environment. And then lastly, communities can increase capacity to have the kind of conversations our democracy needs. Thank you.